What's going on?
Everyone, this is Abir. Abir, this is everyone. How's it going, man? How are you?
Good, good. I've been enjoying the presentation so far, especially
Fantastic.
the battle between Taylor and Jess. I wish it
That
was in
was
person,
spicy.
so it could have been spicier. But no, it was a lot of fun.
Good, good. We have to run it back, but I'm super excited for yours. Everybody, if you don't know Abir, you're gonna get to know him. He's absolutely incredible. Abir's a fractional CMO to e-com brands, and he has a pretty unique background compared to others in our space. So he's a CPA by trade, first and foremost. So when we're speaking numbers, he's that guy. But he also has run his own e-com brand and agency to provide unparalleled level of financial insights, especially about scaling in our worlds. So let's welcome him to the party, everybody. Let's say hi in the chat. Hey, perfect. Okay, so Abir, I'm gonna hand it over to you now, sir. I'm gonna dip out. You're gonna step in, and then
Cool.
I'll come back for Q&A. But I'm excited. Let's give the people what they want. This is gonna be a great one. Cool.
Sounds good.
Most
Appreciate it.
definitely.
Thank you very much.
Most definitely.
All right, cool. So hopefully everybody can see the presentation that I've got put together. So let's get right into it. So this session is entitled "How Creative Strategy Can Improve Contribution Margin." Paige kind of scooped me a bit, and she started talking about contribution profit in the last presentation. So at least now you have someone with clout talking about how important it is. So basically, I'm going to dive into that a little bit more deeply to be able to give you a bit more context as to how it plays into contribution strategy. Creative strategy. Cool. So beginning with who's this guy? So that's me. Just to give you a little bit of background on myself, Evan already did a pretty good introduction, but I have this slide there already, so I'm going to take the time to go through it anyway. So my background, I used to be a science person. I used to work in a lab doing lab things. Somehow I became an accountant at a certain point and became a CPA. I worked as a manager in a Big Four audit firm for a while. Then I was a VP finance at a startup. Raised quite a bit of. Sorry, hold on. Why are people waving at me? Never mind, I'm going to ignore that. Sorry. So then I was a VP finance at a startup, raised quite a bit of money, about $60 million. So a fairly successful one. But then at a certain point during my tenure there, we actually ended up acquiring an e-commerce brand. And for reasons related to maybe a suboptimal HR decisions, let's call it, I ended up running that brand. My department was kind of on autopilot. I took over and really got my hands dirty. I mean, answering all the Zendesk tickets, sending the emails on Klaviyo, running the Facebook ads, putting in orders with the manufacturer, really kind of got deep into e-commerce. That's where I fell in love with e-commerce as an industry. At a certain point when I left there, I actually ran a performance marketing agency for a while. So Google ads, Facebook ads. So I've done quite a bit of media buying and still do a little bit of it on the side. Right now, though, we run an e-commerce accounting firm. We're about 30, 35 people. We are basically provide bookkeeping, CFO services, and all that to e-commerce brands. During my career, realized that there was a pretty big gap amongst accounting firms insofar as their understanding of how e-commerce brands had unique challenges and how to help them. So basically built a company around that. And I'm also a fractional CFO for e-commerce brands. Cool. Hopefully that's an interesting enough background. So moving on, why am I here? It's not to preach to the choir. My goal isn't to come here and tell you all that creative is important. I assume you believe that. That's why you're here. But my intention is to basically reinforce what you already intuitively believe to a certain extent with a little bit deeper a level of understanding. I think we all get that creative is important. If we run ads, we kind of see it just kind of on a day-to-day basis. But I think reinforcing with a bit of math and finance can help reinforce that belief. And it'll also help you to act on that with a little bit more confidence because you know what the very important outcomes are of those efforts that you're making on the creative strategy side. So that's what I'm hoping to achieve today. But first, I have a question. Is finance our friend? For a lot of you, especially if you happen to work in a marketing department or if you are especially in a larger company, you probably run into these issues fairly often where your accounting department, your finance department, they are against the idea of you spending on things that to them will sometimes seem frivolous. I know a lot of larger accounting departments tend to just look at Google Analytics and last click attribution insofar as they make budgeting decisions, and that can get frustrating if you don't have a culture where everybody's on the same page. But the truth is, we're all in this together. We're all trying to win for the brand. We're trying to accomplish things. So there often is a gap between the understanding of, say, the marketing side insofar as how finance works and the finance side insofar as how marketing works. But we are trying to achieve things. So I think that the more you are able to, because I'm mostly talking to marketers here, not finance people, the more you're able to understand the language and the things that matter to the finance side of the business, I think it becomes easier to kind of connect those dots and bridge that gap so that everybody really understands why we're doing what we're doing. So what we're going to cover, three things. Firstly, some valuable finance concepts for DTC brands. We can't cover them completely, but I'm going to skim over a couple of concepts that are, I'd say, are the more important ones for DTC. I know that there are a lot of different people in the audience. Some of you are creatives, some of you are marketers, some of you are agencies, some of you are brand owners. So there might be a varying amount of familiarity with the things I'm going to cover. I'll try to cover them quickly and simply enough so that everybody is on the same page. And I also put it at the beginning because if I put it at the end, people would probably leave. So the accounting stuff, I got you locked into to get through that with me. After that, we'll talk about how creative affects the brand's financial performance, because at the end of the day, that's kind of really what matters. We're trying to make money here. So we want to make sure that what we're doing on the creative side, how is that actually linked to financial performance? And at the end, I have my little special surprise for you where I'm going to give you a tool that allows us to actually plan for the impact of our creative efforts on the financial outcomes for the business. So to begin, financial concepts for DTC brands. What are some of these basic concepts I'm talking about? First one, we'll go through it quickly, is gross profit and gross margin. Now, gross profit is how much you're making from the sale of the goods. It's basically the revenue from how much you're selling minus the cost of the goods sold. So it's what's left over after you paid for the items and you sold it. Your gross margin is a similar concept, but slightly different. It's just taking your gross profit and dividing it by your net revenue. Two very similar numbers or concepts, but they're linked in a certain way. I'll try to explain with an example. Hopefully you can see my cursor over here. So let's say in July of 2023, we had gross sales of 100,000, discounts of 10K. So we have net sales of 90K, just 100 minus 10. If our COGS, or our cost of goods sold, is 30K, our gross profit is just the 90 minus the 30, so 60. And that gives us a gross margin of 67 because it's 60,000 divided by 90,000. In August, if we were to increase our gross sales, let's say we run a big promo and we decide to increase our gross sales by 20%, but we were able to do that because we discounted fairly heavily. So we got, instead of discounting 10K, we tripled our discounts that month. Our net sales are still going to be 90K. The reason this is important to pay attention to is most brands will oftentimes just be focusing on their net sales. ROAS, which is everybody's favorite number to look at, is just looking at your net sales and comparing it to your ad spend. What it doesn't take into consideration is your cost of goods sold, which is what is important because that's what determines your gross profit. So you'll see in this case, even though our net sales were the same, our cost of goods sold actually goes up because that's in relation to your gross sales. To be able to sell more, for your gross sales to go up, it's because you sold more units, and more units means more cost. So even though your net sales stayed the same, your cost of goods sold went up. So your gross profit actually goes down, as does your gross margin. So again, just wanted to touch upon this simply, just in case it was not necessarily at the forefront of a lot of people's consciousness. Even if it is something you are aware of technically, I think it's important that people have it top of mind when they are talking about the performance aspect of what their marketing is doing, because the changes in your gross margin matter because of how they affect profitability. And those changes are hidden if you're just looking at something like ROAS and kind of making all decisions based on that. A lot of brands will have a target ROAS, for example, where they're just thinking about, our target ROAS is a 2.2. But they don't necessarily take into consideration that if they run a campaign where they're doing bundles, where different things have different margins, or they're giving away free gifts, or they decide to offer free shipping, or if they decide to do some heavy discounting, those all affect what your target ROAS is going to be because the costs associated with that offer are higher. So just want to touch upon that quickly. Moving on now to the magic finance metric. So there's a number even more important than gross profit. It's contribution margin, because Paige talked about it. But first, to just understand it a little bit better, I'll talk about fixed versus variable costs. This is a slight detour. We'll get through it quickly, but understanding this concept is how you can understand contribution margin with a little bit more depth. So of all the costs and expenses that you incur in your business, very broadly, we can put them into two buckets. You have fixed costs and variable costs. Fixed ones are those that don't change as your revenue scales up or down. So if you double your revenue or half your revenue, your fixed costs don't change. The classic example is rent. Typically, if you triple your revenue month over month, your rent stays the same. Nothing's going to change there. Variable costs are ones that do scale up and down. Simple example would be transaction fees. If you double your revenue, double your transaction fees. Half your revenue, half transaction fees. Now, the truth is most costs are mixed. They're not perfectly fixed or perfectly variable. They lie somewhere kind of on a spectrum where they will change somewhat with sales increasing, but not entirely. So just to give you a little bit of examples to kind of drive that point home, if you double your revenue, do you double your transaction fees? Typically, yes, you will. Do you double your ad spend? Usually you'll more than double your ad spend. Do you double your UGC costs? Probably not. Like, you'll probably find some good winners, so you might spend more on UGC, but you're not going to really double it necessarily. Do you double your email marketing expenses? Generally, no. I mean, Klaviyo subscription fee might go up, but your cost to send an email to 10 people or 10,000 people is about the same. Do you double your payroll? Usually, no. Maybe your customer service reps, but overall, no. Do you double your software costs? Some, but not all. So the point really is that it's not always so clear what is exactly fixed or what is exactly variable, but it is still, it can require some judgment to know exactly where to bucket things. Now, why did I spend some time going on this? Because that understanding is very important to be able to calculate your contribution margin. So your contribution margin is the amount left over from revenue after variable expenses to cover fixed expenses. So essentially, putting that a little bit differently, if you take your revenue and were to double it, the variable expenses will double along with it. And what's left over when you take your revenue plus your variable expenses, that needs to cover your fixed expenses, or else you won't be profitable. So ultimately, it is what funds the business, and it's crucial to be able to make decisions around scaling. I'll give you some examples soon, and you'll see why it can be so impactful for decision making. And it also determines the minimum activity needed for the business to survive. So if your contribution margin isn't enough to cover your fixed expenses, then you're incurring losses. So a lot of times, for example, during the earlier presentations, people talk about, like, the most important thing is just that we are generating revenue, and that is true to an extent. But the more important thing is really that we're generating contribution margin, because that is what allows us to be able to keep the business afloat. So, like I said, knowing which expenses are variable versus fixed can be a little bit tricky, but the usual items to consider: ad spend, shipping expenses, transaction fees, some software if they're like very directly linked to your ad spend levels, agency fees, especially if they have a performance component. So if you're going to be paying them more when your sales go up, that's relevant, and possibly influencers, especially if you're compensating them for the amount of ad spend you're putting behind their content. So those are some basic ones. So now, a tale of contribution margin madness. How can a misunderstanding of this concept lead you to make the wrong decision? So I have a little bit of a story that I'm going to tell through numbers, because I'm an accountant, and hopefully this will give you an idea of how people who don't understand contribution margin can go down the wrong path with their decision making. So I'm going to try to keep this really simple, just hopefully you can follow along with me. We have a brand. They have a blended ROAS of 4. Their ads spend is about $250,000. That gives them a revenue of, mathematically, $1 million. They don't do any discounting, so we're just going to keep this simple. Just $1 million of revenue. No discounts, that's the total rev. Their cost of goods sold is about 30%, so $300,000, meaning their gross profit, which is revenue less COGS, is $700,000. For the sake of this example, we'll ignore all the additional costs like shipping fees, transaction fees, all that. The only thing we're going to deduct for contribution margin is going to be the ad spend. So 700 minus 250 gives me a contribution margin of 450. And if your fixed costs are 300,000, that gives you a 150,000 profit. Cool? So that's my baseline scenario. Now, let's say all of a sudden Senor Zuckerberg makes some changes to the platform of Meta, and then all of a sudden the ROAS goes down. So over here, ROAS has decreased. So our ROAS went from our blended ROAS went from a 4 to a 3. We have the same ad spend, which means we have a gross profit now of 525 instead of 700. 525 minus a 250 gives us a contribution margin of 275. So our contribution margin has decreased quite substantially. Our fixed costs, though, do not change because they're fixed. Now, all of a sudden, this company is experiencing a $25,000 loss. When faced with a situation like this, unfortunately, a lot of brand owners will look at that and say, well, my target ROAS is a 4. And so if my ROAS goes down to a 3, I must lower my ad spend to get back to a 4. So let's say they make that decision. This would be the outcome. They would, for example, lower their ad spend from 250 to 150. They get back to a 4 ROAS, which sounds good. But now, because of that, their gross profit is 420 because they have a lower level of revenue because of the lower ad spend. Their contribution margin is now 420 minus 150, so 270. They've actually decreased their or increased their loss. They're less profitable because of the fact that they lowered their ad spend. They may have a higher ROAS, but because they have a lower ad spend, at the end of the day, it's not that you could have a 50 ROAS. It doesn't matter. The thing that matters more than anything is your contribution margin. And so if you lower your contribution margin even further, you're actually hurting yourself more. And the problem is this can create a death spiral because you'll end up, if you are spending less on ads today, chances are you're going to have less of a blended ROAS over time because of the fact that you're acquiring fewer customers, you have less of a halo effect, etc. So this can start getting a little bit worse over time. So what does the courageous brand owner who knows finance do instead? They'll actually increase their ad spend. Now, you might say, but hold on, Abir, if you increase your ad spend, you're going to hurt your ROAS even more. And that is true. The question really becomes, how much are you hurting your ROAS? Are you dropping it down to a 1.1? Or is there some level at which it can be a reasonable hit to take? The answer is on my slide. So if, for example, the same person decided to increase their ad spend from 250 to 350, the ROAS went down to a 2.65. I selected this number very particularly. So if their ROAS goes down to a 2.65, they're actually now able to generate just enough contribution margin to cover their fixed expenses and become break even or hit break even. Now, granted, it's not always that simple. You might drop to a 1.1 if you increase your ad spend by that much. The point is more that I wanted to illustrate a point using simple examples that ultimately the decisions that you make should not be around your blended ROAS. It shouldn't be around your revenue number. It has to be around contribution margin. Granted, you can also try to deduct, like improve your fixed costs. You can go make changes there. You can, downsize rent or get rid of software you don't need or fire people if you have to, unfortunately. But those are not easy decisions to make, and they also take a lot of time to implement. On a week-to-week basis or a month-to-month basis, the things you can affect a little bit more directly are going to be things of contribution margin and upwards. So it's your variable expenses, it's your ad spend, it's the offers, it's the revenue. So hopefully that can give you at least a bit of an idea of why contribution margin is so important and why misunderstanding it can be very problematic. All right, moving on. Contribution margin calculator. So this is one of the tools that I've put together. I've shared this with a lot of people. I'll be able to share it with you guys as well at the end, but I'll just walk you through it just to give you an idea of how what I have explained thus far can be put into practice. So this is it's just screenshots, but I have an actual Google sheet for this. I just didn't want to have to switch around during the presentation lest it runs into some technical issues. But essentially the way this works is that if you plug in your variable expenses, so you put in your percentage of cost of goods sold, shipping, transaction fees, others, etc., that can allow you to determine how much contribution margin you'll get per order for varying CACs and various AOVs. So you can, for example, determine that at a 40 CAC, if I offer as a 65 AOV, I'll break even. Also, I'll roughly break even at a 52 CAC with an $85 AOV. So this allows you to do a little bit of scenario analysis to determine kind of what is a profitable order. There is, of course, a little bit more depth in that because I would rather have a $5 contribution margin per order if that gives me 10,000 orders for $50,000 rather than a $50 contribution margin per order if I can only sell that to 100 people because that's only $5,000. So you take it one step further. And then if you look at your additional fixed expenses as well, you can then determine, fine, so at what ROAS, blended ROAS, and at what ad spend am I able to achieve profitability? So again, I don't want to spend too much time on this. It was really just to kind of illustrate how this can be put into practice. Like I said, I'll share this afterwards. So moving on now to the next section. If you're still with me, thank you for making it through the accounting part. Secret is there is still more accounting, but it's at least hopefully a little bit more relevant. So how creative affects a brand's financial performance? Certain decisions about your creative strategy are obviously going to directly affect the financial outcomes of the business. This is what we all care about, so let's see how that can happen. To illustrate the point, I'm going to start off with a little bit of a simple analogy, hopefully one that's easy enough to follow. Creative is basically your sales team. Each ad has a purpose and a job, whether that be talking to people at the top of the funnel or the bottom of the funnel. They're essentially coaxing people along the sales process so that they can get them to convert. So every ad can be thought of as a salesperson in this analogy. So let's say you have a sales team and you have 3 salespeople and each one's doing 100 sales per month. That gives you 300 sales per month. Now you have the option of either hiring better salespeople or training them, which means that if their efficiency improves from 100 per person per month to 120, that'll give you 360 sales per month. Or you could add more people. You could just hire more folks. And so instead of 3 people, you have 5 people. That could take you from 300 sales to 500 sales. Or you could do both. And if you increase your efficiency and the number of people you have, that'll take you from 300 sales to 600 sales. So how does this translate into creative? Well, essentially, again, not that it's a secret, the efforts need to be focused around more and better ads. That's what we need to be able to achieve to be able to improve the scale of our business overall. So what makes creative a winner? We'll often talk about, better creative, and there's been a lot of debate during the day about what makes creative better. I will try to put this into finance terms. These are not the only things to consider, but I find them a helpful way to look at it. So a good creative is not just a higher ROAS. Put it a little bit more simply, there's 3 things that I pay attention to. Does it improve your AOV? So are you able to, for example, sell a bundle instead of selling just a single product? Are you able to sell a more expensive product? Are you able to sell, if you're on a subscription, can you get people to buy a 6-month subscription instead of just a monthly one? So improving AOV. Does it have a better CAC? Does it convert for a cheaper cost or acquire customers more cheaply? And the third one is very important. Can it scale to higher spends at the same performance? I'm sure you've all experienced this where you have an ad, it's performing quite well at, say, $100 a day, and you up that to $130 a day, and then it starts faltering and not performing quite as well. So the ads that can scale further are going to be able to have a big impact. So again, another table, because I love tables. Let's look at the impact or what that could look like. Hopefully it's easy to follow along. So let's say in our baseline scenario over here, we have a $90 AOV, a $30 CAC, COGS and other costs altogether, that adds up to $63.75 of cost for that $90 AOV. That gives us a contribution margin per order of 90 minus 63.75 of 26.25. Cool. If I'm spending 300K on ads, I have 10,000 orders. That gives me a contribution margin of 262.5. Let's say I increase my AOV from 90 to 99. The impact of that is I can increase my contribution margin by 24%. Let's say instead of increasing my AOV, I actually lower my CAC from 30 to 27. That'll also give me a 24% improvement in contribution margin. Let's say I keep the same CAC and the same AOV, but I'm able to do that at a higher, very specifically numbered spend. So now I was able to get to $300,000 of spend at a $30 CAC, but couldn't go further than that. But the new ads that I'm creating actually appeals to a broader audience or whatever. So now I can actually scale to a higher level that can also allow me to achieve a 24% increase in my contribution margin. So the best creative isn't just giving you a good ROAS, but it keeps performing as you continue to scale. And how that does that is maybe something a lot of people debate, but from my vantage point, the way I often think about it is that it'll appeal to a larger audience, and it will continue to perform as more and more people see it and doesn't cause creative fatigue too quickly. So essentially, again, driving home the same point, we want to be able to generate higher contribution margins, and we can do that by figuring out what makes our ads perform better than the old ones. So how does winning creative then enable us to scale over a longer time horizon? A concept, or a way that I like to put it, is this concept of achieving exit velocity with our creative. Let's think of a scenario. A brand is spending $2,000 a month on creative. So whatever that be, whether it's a copywriter, creative strategist, on the video design or video editor, graphic design person, whatever it is. At the end of the day, they're spending $2,000 a month on creative. That allows them to develop or generate a certain quantity and quality of creative for that given investment. And that investment only allows them to basically cap out at about 100K of revenue. So every month they put out some more creative, it runs for a little while, it starts to die, then they put out more creative the next month. That $2,000 a month is basically the minimum necessary for them to not decline. Because if they turn off their creative pipeline, they just decide to stop spending entirely on creative, they used to be at 100K, but chances are, as creative fatigue sets in, some creatives start dying, they're going to start decreasing in revenue. So that 2K is just the minimum they need to stay where they are. Which also means that if they were to increase their investment in creative, that's what's going to allow them to start improving, to be able to achieve exit velocity from that plateau, because you're going to be able to test a higher volume of creatives, which means you might be able to test more and find winners more frequently, which then allows you to stack more creatives running that are very strong at the same time. Plus, each individual creative has a higher chance of being a banger. So this can allow you to improve over time to achieve higher levels of scale. So now moving on to the last section, how to measure creative strategy impact. So hopefully this is the section that will give you a lot more excitement because it's something you can take with you. So how do we follow the numbers that ultimately matter to a business rather than just what we intuitively believe? We're going to combine all the concepts I've talked about thus far into this term that I coined called creative contribution margin. The concept is basically how much additional value am I unlocking from a contribution margin perspective for the investment in creative that I'm making. So if I'm going to spend more on creative, how much more value I'm getting? Because there's no point in spending more on creative if you're not actually getting a value for it. We're all here to make positive financial decisions and outcomes. So just to think about it really quickly, what are some of the costs to augment the creative machine? It could be working with a creative strategist. Maybe you were doing everything yourself before. Now you hire someone fancy pants who's really good at what they do, and they're very good at creative strategy. So you work with them on an hourly basis or hire someone full-time. You hire more graphic designers or video editors or people who are more skilled at that. You hire script writers. Again, before maybe you're just letting the creators that you work with write their own scripts. Now you're writing it for them. Perhaps you start using more cloutful content creators who might have been using randos, and now you can afford to work with people who are actually have their own followings and are well known. It could be because you start investing in software, like our sponsor, Motion. So all of these are basically investments that you can make into your creative machine. But again, like I said, they all ultimately need to unlock value to be worth any of this effort. And the reason is that certain levels of spend can't even really be achieved if you're not actually generating enough creative iteration and improvement, because realistically, if you have like 3 or 4 ads and you're not really spending on creative, there's very little chance that you're going to be able to spend $500,000 a month on Facebook. Like, you just can't really hit that level. So to be able to achieve that exit velocity and be able to hit higher levels of scale, that investment in creative needs to be made. We've all kind of discussed that all day. So how do we actually measure it? Using my creative contribution margin calculator, which I will also share, but let me just walk you through how it will look so that you can, again, perform some of the scenario analysis. So how can we determine the impact of our investments in creatives? More tables. Let's look at a baseline situation. We have an AOV of $90, a CAC of $30, and a CAC scaling increment of $125. This is something I'm kind of making up as a concept. You can think of this scaling limitation in any other way. You can talk about it from a ROAS perspective, from a CAC perspective, whatever. The idea is basically this. Just because an ad happens to perform, say, at a $30 CAC at, say, $10,000 a month, we all know that if we were to double that to $20,000 a month, it's not going to stay at that $30 CAC. Its performance is going to decrease as it scales. So this number is essentially measuring how much your CAC will go up as you scale up. And that number, not that I'm saying it's easy to calculate, this is more for illustrative purposes, will vary from one ad to the next. Some have a lot of scale potential, some have less scale potential. And to a certain extent, it's all a function of which pocket or audience of users it actually appeals to. So each ad is going to have a different CAC scaling increment. And again, we can think of this in different ways, but this is what I'm going to use for the sake of this example. So for what I'm going to be showing you, basically for each increment in ad spend, which in this case is going to be every $50,000, the CAC is going to go up by $1.25. So from $30 to $31.25, for example. So if this is our baseline situation, what will that look like in terms of ad spend? So on this chart, you have your ad spend over here, and you have your contribution margin generated on the y-axis. So at $0, you have zero contribution margin, but as you're increasing your ad spend, it's going to start increasing or bringing in more and more contribution margin because the ad is still in the hot pocket, like in a zone where it can perform well. It's going to peak, and then over time, your contribution margin will start to go down because the CAC is going to go up. But that still can be quite profitable. Still a lot of money coming in, and at a certain point, you're going to basically wipe out all the benefits. So given this baseline example, we're going to say that you can achieve your maximum contribution margin at around $450K of ad spend. But if our fixed expenses, just as an example, are at around $100,000, I know I need to be spending somewhere in this range over here. You could choose to maximize profit, so still be at the 450K, so all this little extra gap here is just going to be profit. Or you could try to be aggressive about scaling, and you're going to say, I'm going to spend to the absolute top end of the range, so I'm still going to be above break even, but I'm going to be acquiring as many customers as possible. That's just a business decision. So let's say now we decide to invest in creative. In the baseline scenario, we didn't invest in anything. Here, I'm just going to add in a couple of examples of things, but this can obviously look very differently. So we're going to pay $8,000 a month to a creative strategist. We're going to incur some other creative costs of $600 a month, and a percentage of our ad spend is going to go to creative as well. So for every 100K we spend on ads, 5% of that we're going to spend on creators or scriptwriters or whatever. So let's say we actually decide to make these investments on the creative side, but we don't improve our creative metrics, our financial metrics in any way. The issue here is that if we don't have an improvement in performance, it's just a loss. So to look at it on a chart, essentially, the blue was our baseline. If you look over here to the red, you're going to see that at $0, you're obviously losing money because you are incurring $8,600 of cost over here. And also you're going to peak at a lower level, and you're going to be able to scale less further because you have additional costs that you're incurring, but it's not driving any new value. So fairly simple concept. I mean, I'm sure most of you can kind of intuitively guess that that's how it would look. So moving now to a minimum viable performance. This will tell us what is the minimum amount of improvement we need to be able to experience such that we're actually compensating for the additional costs. So if I'm going to spend an extra $8,600 and 5% of my ad spend on creative, as an example, this can obviously manifest in different ways, but let's just say if I were to improve my AOV from $90 to $95, that would give me just enough of an improvement to be able to kind of break even. So I need at least that much of an improvement for me to be able to recover the costs of investing in creative. But let's say that instead of just getting a $5 improvement in AOV, I actually got a $100 improvement in AOV. So it went from 90 to 100. What would that look like? Well, in this case, I'll actually be able to hit a higher peak. So my peak will actually be at around $500,000 of ad spend and give me a much, much greater contribution margin. And also, if my fixed expenses were 100,000, in the baseline scenario, I can only spend 750. But over here, I can spend about, I don't know, what is that, 875? So you can scale much further because you have a higher AOV. Similarly, it's not just about the AOV. What if we would just improve our CAC? So our AOV is going to be the same. We're going to go from 90 to 90. Our CAC is going to go from 30 to 25. Same concept. You're going to have this massive improvement over here. Much higher peak contribution margin, and you can scale much further. And then the third example, probably you can anticipate it, is what if we just improve the scaling ratio? So let's say we just happen to make an ad that is now more broadly appealing. It has the same CAC, the same AOV, but it scales much better. It goes much further. This will give you the greatest possible improvement. You're going to peak higher and you can scale much, much further at much higher levels of ad spend without hitting your break-even point. So again, these are kind of made up numbers, obviously, just for the sake of making them very clear to visually illustrate. I can share this calculator with you afterwards, and then you guys can kind of play around with it and do your own scenario analysis. But the point simply was to be able to financially depict what the impact is of the investments we're making in our creative. Because somebody will come to you and say, why are we spending all this money on creative? Well, if I can improve my AOV, I can improve my CAC, or I can scale a lot better, you'll see you'll get a lot more contribution margin out of that investment. And that allows you to make a lot more profit or scale a lot harder, which can lead to obviously much better outcomes down the road as well. So essentially, what we're looking at is our creative to scale ratio as one of our biggest levers insofar as being able to allow us to keep scaling. Essentially, I'm just repeating myself, but ads that appeal to larger groups of people and don't fatigue as hard allows us to have a better creative scale ratio. So that's that $1.25 increment that I kind of threw in there just for the sake of the example. And it doesn't have to necessarily be, obviously, the whole time I'm talking here, I'm talking about this one ad, but like we all know this. You don't have the one ad to rule them all that we're all trying to like dig in the dirt to find that diamond ad. It can be a suite of ads as well. So you can have, for example, one ad that might be able to handle $1 million of ad spend because it's just so fantastic and appeals to a whole bunch of people. Or you could have 5 really good ads, each that can handle 200K, each that appeals to a sub pocket of those people, and together can lift the entire account. So it's not about just one ad. I say it just for the sake of simplicity. But the point is that, coming back to what I said earlier, the more testing that you do, the better the creatives that you come up with, and the higher a volume of creatives that you have that individually perform well, that gives you a suite of high performance ads that can together raise the profitability of the account. So I guess we're pretty close to done. I talked a lot faster than I realized I would because I guess I'm a little nervous. So some practical takeaways so that you're able to kind of work with everything we've gone through so far. So how much to spend on creative? That number will naturally vary depending on who you're talking to, but a good rule of thumb is going to be somewhere between 5 to 10% of your investment in ad spend. So if you're spending 100K on ad spend, 5 to 10K a month should be going to some creative strategy or creative generation efforts. That number might be a little bit lower, or higher if you are at the lower end of the spectrum in terms of ad spend. Because if you're still trying to figure out or find your footing on Facebook, you're spending, 3 to 5K a month, you might have to spend much more than 5 to 10% just because there's no point in scaling. There's no point in even spending that money if you haven't found something that can at least get you a little bit of traction. So the lower ends, it might be a little bit higher. But what if you're a boss and you're actually spending $10 million a month? Do you spend $500,000 on creative each month? I mean, you could if you wanted. Chances are you could probably peel back a little bit. And it doesn't mean you're going to be spending, testing 500 pieces of UGC per week in the account. But it could mean that you're just able to invest in much more high quality pieces of UGC. Maybe you're able to work with fancy, expensive influencers or celebrities instead of content creators. So there's other ways that you can decide to invest that. But the point is that 5 to 10% is a rough takeaway, and it can depend on the scale that you're at. Am I done? Yes, I'm done. So you can find me on the internet. That's where I belong. We help out with full cycle accounting and CFO services. So reach out to connect if you want on Twitter or X. I'm Abir_CPA, and send me a DM and I'll send you all those links I talked about for the calculators. And now I am open to questions. Evan, back to you.
Abir, first of all, incredible information in there. Second of all, as a member of like the 2X speaking club, I'm not mad at all that you finished early. I motor through everything myself, in all honesty.
Fair enough. I have a bad habit of listening to everything on 2x, so I talk at 2x.
Me too. Me too. Like when I try to watch myself back and it's
Yeah.
2X, I'm like, oh, I gotta slow it down. This is too much. This is too
Yeah.
much. Everybody, what did you think? I know that was a ton of information, all valuable on your ends. Let's throw it in the chat. How are we feeling? I saw some good feedback all throughout. Yep. Fire emojis. There we go. I love it. I love it. This is why I was excited, folks. Like this was the sauce. This was the sauce. So Abir, we have a bunch of Q&A that's popping up, and we're sharing your socials in the chat there as well. But before
Cool.
we dive into some of the questions, I did want to go back and like touch upon some of the topics that we were talking about. And I think like to set the stage, we should have done this at the beginning. It's my apologies. Everybody who's here, if you've already filled out this poll, no worries. But if you haven't, we're going to put it up on screen now. Just curious to know the roles that you're currently holding. The main reason that we want to get this information up in a second. There we go. So the main reason we want to get this information perfect is because I given a presentation to kick off the day of the multiple levels of an organization where it's impactful. So it's like the org level, the team level, so media buying and creative teams, and the individual contributor level, right? And a lot of these concepts span through all of these bricks here, and we want to know like who are we mainly talking to, so we can kind of position it in the necessary ways.
Yeah,
Cool.
I knew that it was going to be a very broad mix of people, so it's a little tricky to know exactly where to hit insofar as information, given that some people know nothing about accounting, and some people who, for example, are in management C-suite or brand owners, they obviously spend a lot more time thinking about it. So hopefully I kind of threaded that line reasonably well, but yeah.
You killed it. You killed
Oh,
it.
thank
And
you.
I think
You're so
like
sweet.
the biggest piece that I wanna hit home for everybody here, now that we're seeing a lot of like the individual levels of people jumping in, is why is all of this important? Like let's start with the goal. Like we know the financials, but if we were to simplify the hell out of it, it's like why do people need to care about this in your opinion?
Well, ultimately, I mean, even if we have a very mission-driven brand, at the end of the day, we're all here to make money. Even just to be able to sustain the business, to keep doing what we're doing, it requires money. So I think that no matter who's involved in any part of the business's process in whatever sort of relationship, they know that at the very least, if they have this one North Star to care about, it helps everybody stay aligned, or at the very least have things that they can all focus on. I mean, it's not uncommon for people who are sometimes on the agency side, you can have this relationship. Sometimes marketers are like this. Sometimes if the finance people at the company are chiming in, they can have different opinions about what they need to focus on. So the accountants are going to be like, oh, we need to lower expenses. It's the most common thing. I get it. And the marketers are going to be like, no, we need to spend more on ads because our ROAS and et cetera. But if we have this one thing and we can all agree that contribution margin is all that matters, and we have not only the shared language, but also that clear understanding of how everything connects, it's a lot easier for people to be on the same page about those things and kind of make sure that we're all working and kind of rowing in the same direction, so to speak.
Yeah, and I want to pull out one particular piece in there that you had mentioned, because something that comes to mind for me is you talked about the different roles and you identified things they might individually care about at the end of the day. So when we're talking about contribution margin, in your opinion, who needs to care about this most? Is it truly everyone across the board? Is it a subset of people that then, or is it like high level then filters down? Talk us through that.
That's a great question. So I'd say that pretty much everybody should care about it because of the fact that it is one of the things that almost anybody has some degree of direct influence upon. The only argument I would make to the contrary, if I wanted to fight myself, would be that the owners might care more about profit. But the difference between profit and contribution margin to a certain extent is just your fixed expenses. And the thing is that on a day-to-day basis, the marketer is not going to show up and be like, hey, we should lower our rent. Most people aren't going to be able to have any sort of impact on fixed expenses because of the way that strategically those decisions are made, and also because of the fact that they are very usually slow decisions to enact or to improve upon. So yeah, sure, profit and cash flow, and I'll make that caveat. That cash flow at the end of the day is arguably more important than contribution margin, but that's a very complex concept, so I'm not going to talk about that here. And also, that's a lot more impacted by operational side of things rather than anything a marketer can impact for the most part. But yeah, contribution margin, one of the absolute most important metrics, just because of the fact that it is very impactful and everybody has a much more direct relationship with how that number pans out.
Cool. Cool. Okay. I actually wanted to share a couple thoughts because like I've said I'm excited about the session a bunch already and like I kind of want to outline why and then pepper in your thoughts after the
That's because I
fact of like
paid you.
where I missed. Shut up, man. You did not pay me. But basically like when we're talking about contribution margin, I want to talk to now the individuals who are on the ground, hands on keyboard. So our media buyers, our creative teams, our creative strategists, everybody who's here with us at the end of the day. So on the media buying side, what I was really excited about is when we're talking about contribution margin, what we're really defining is scale. Oftentimes we're talking about some arbitrary benchmark or a goal that we might not actually know why we've set it as what it is. And what contribution margin is allowing us to do, it's saying like what is actually profitable for us on that first order. So we're making sure that we're good to go and over time, just making sure that it's continuous. So on the media buy side, I think about it as scale. The other thing, and the other reason why I was excited, and honestly a little bit more, is for our creative strategists and creative team members are in the room. So we experienced this during that in the debate that we had a little bit earlier. But a
Mhm.
big question to ask is like, how do we quantify the creative impact of what's really going on there? And when we cut the noise, that's
Yeah.
where contribution margin starts to actually give us those insights. So what was super exciting about that is when I'm thinking about, for context, everybody, like if we take it there, like compensation on what it would make sense for on, okay, for a creative strategist, what's the impact that you're going to have by you putting numbers beside your name, the arbitrary table, you get to sit at it now in terms of those decisions at a higher level, not just the granular. So giving the language and then giving the tools and resources, even though it's a little bit made up, I think has really empowered people along the way. That's my really quick spiel. I don't know if you have anything else to pepper on there though, in terms of
No,
like
I
how
think
I'm viewing the world.
it's an excellent point, and I think that to maybe make it a little bit more intimately, or to bring it one step closer to the strategists and the creatives specifically, obviously there's maybe not that much of an impact that they can have on the cost of goods sold directly, and or for example the payroll and stuff like that. But I think where the impact is a lot more directly within their control, obviously the ads and how that can scale and what its CAC is. But I think a missed one is the choice of products that they actually push. This might be not super relevant insofar as a company that has, or a brand that has one product, but especially some that have a larger suite of products, and especially if those products have different margins, which is not always going to be a very huge variance, but it can happen. For example, in the case of apparel, I've oftentimes they have much bigger margin differences, especially if you carry accessories or supplements as well. Being able to determine which offers are the best ones to push impacts your contribution margin. So knowing that, okay, let me just sell the cheapest product with the highest ROAS. Okay, cool. Yeah, he's going to give you a good ROAS, I suppose. But at the same time, you have to look at your cost. You have to look at the whether or not can you increase AOV. Which one actually retains customers better? Some products are better as a first time sell. Some are better as a retention sell. Some products are harder to sell on social because they're so expensive. Like all of those things need to be taken into consideration because the impact is beyond just your ROAS. So I think thinking about it a little bit more deeply can also inform the strategy from a creative side insofar as what am I trying to sell?
Perfect. And I want to get to some of these questions now. And this is going to be an oversimplification, but as you're going through your presentation, I think
Mm-hmm.
people, I really believe they followed the numbers. Like it's so
Good.
straightforward, it makes sense. I think on my end, where a lot of the delineation will happen is in two worlds. Number
Mm-hmm.
one, it's like where do I go to get this information to inform my decision making? So if I'm a media buyer, what does that look like? But then number two, how do I educate people along the way to think in this way of like contribution margin at the end of the day? So the first question I wanted to kick off with is like, let's say I'm an individual creative strategist, I'm an individual media buyer, and I'm trying to get a sense of contribution margin. Like, where can I start? Who should I talk to be able to get some of this information?
So are you talking about just understanding the concept or to be able to understand it on the side of the brand?
So let's say they have the template that you had
Yeah,
showed where
yeah,
it's like,
yeah,
I'm filling it out now,
yeah.
ultimately. And it's kind of like, damn, I don't have control over this. I don't know where to get it. Who should they be talking to ultimately get this information?
That's a fantastic question. So generally speaking, a lot of that information should exist with the brand itself.
Mhm.
Oftentimes, depending on the size of the brand, it'll be either the owner or their accounting department. And if they don't know those numbers, they should probably refer them to us so we can figure it out for them. Because realistically, if you don't know those numbers, and it's actually quite surprising how many brands don't. Actually, it's probably not surprising, but a lot of brands really don't know. It's very hard to be able to make those kinds of decisions to understand what are you doing, how are you scaling, what's going on, because you just don't know. So I think that you touch upon a good point that the a a vendor or a strategist or a marketer or whatever who is genuinely invested in trying to drive the best outcomes for a brand should be talking using the language and the metrics that matter the most to the brand. They can come in and say, hey, I'll get you a great ROAS, And like even the simplest example is just discounting. Like if you run discounts, you can make your low ROAS look fantastic, but clearly you're making less profit, right? So being able to talk in terms that the brand actually cares about, like contribution margin, will not only make you seem more sophisticated, but also will align you a lot better. But it like you said, it's sometimes they don't know, so you try to ask them, try to get it from them, and if they don't, then you tell them like, hey, that's, you can send them this presentation, be like, this is why it should matter to you.
I love it. Okay, so let's shift to the audience questions now. The first one falls into that bucket of communication. So Mark has the most upvoted question right now. Shout out to Mark. A question from the agency perspective. How do you have this conversation with a brand? How do you talk about contribution margin, financials, etc.? What if the client doesn't want to share this information with you? So honestly, springboarding off what we were talking about.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, like I mentioned, I used to do agency work. So I've kind of run into this in the past as well. I think that it's about first setting the stage insofar as why this information is coming up, and also displaying to them, I think, that you care about what their financial outcomes are. It's very uncommon that a brand would hear that you're coming into this conversation saying, look, I want to make you the most profit possible. I want to be able to help you achieve financial outcomes. To do that, I have this contribution margin calculator. So if we can fill it out, we'll be able to better determine what actual performance metrics to pay attention to and how to achieve the best outcomes for you. So I am hard pressed to think that any brand would be very reluctant to share that information. Sure, they're not going to give you access to QuickBooks, but they should at the very least understand, A, they'll respect you more, B, they'll understand what you're trying to achieve and be able to help work with you to at least enter that information. And even if it really comes down to it, and they really don't want to share anything, I would just give them the calculator and be like, look, you plug in the numbers. If you don't want to share them, fine. But at the very least, now you can tell me targets that I can pay attention to. Take a screenshot of that little table at the bottom that tell me different ROAS and different ad spend. Because then the conversation that's so common for agencies is when you go in to talk to somebody and you ask them like, what's your budget? They're like, well, if you can scale to the moon, like if the ROAS is like infinite, I'll scale to the moon. And it's like, yeah, okay, cool. Thanks, bro. That doesn't help me at all. But at least if you have a table like that and you say, fine, at these different ad spends these are the ROAS, this is my ad spend. Well, that's your answer to the question. Now I know what my budget is because it's a function of your contribution margin. So I think working from there, hopefully, would be a little bit of an easy way to have that conversation.
And there's also something in there about like the actual template itself. So it's a really strong communication tool, like everything Abir ran through to be able to talk your client through what's going on as a very first step. Sweet. The second most upvoted question is from Vince. So shout out to Vince. This is now getting more into like the tactics as it applies to the goals. So say your meta return on ad spend is 0.5 and your break-even ROAS is 2x. Based on your contribution margin, should you turn off non-performing ads and focus on creative testing instead of to get your ROAS up before scaling up spend?
This is a great question. So I'd say there's two parts to it. The first one is more of an attribution war question. If you have a meta ROAS of 0.5, but you actually happen to have a blended ROAS that's a lot better because of the fact that maybe you're running one-day click, maybe you have a very expensive product, maybe it has a long consideration window, whatever the case might be, maybe your pixel got uninstalled and you didn't realize it. There's more to it than just what your meta ROAS is specifically. So there's something to be said about in-platform attribution and off-platform, whatever. But I think the broader point is that really, if your performance is not where it needs to be on the ad platform, regardless of what that number is, you should, this kind of comes to the point I was making towards the end, you should very likely reduce the amount that you're spending on ads and invest that into first cracking the code about how you can scale on ads. Because ultimately, let's say your ROAS actually is a 0.5. That means for every $100 you're putting in, you're getting $50 of revenue. And of that $50 of revenue, your gross profit's like, I don't know, $30 or something. So you're just losing money. And the thing is, you can't, this isn't the olden days where like, you know, I'd be using surfing strategies and horizontal scaling and all these different media buying tricks and different interest in ABOs where I can use all this hacking approach to media buying to hack my way out of poverty. Like really the only way these days to be able to achieve some sort of ability to scale on meta is because you have the creative that makes you deserve that scale. So there's no point in just spending more and more and more. Exception being if you have a brand new pixel, brand new ad account, sure, the first few days is going to suck. You have to just kind of bite the bullet there. But if you're not performing well, it's probably because your ads suck. And so you may as well take 100% of that spend or like 90% of it, put it into the creative iteration until you find something that's going to do well that allows you to scale. But just spending more on meta, it's not going to get you anywhere. So yes, that's my answer.
Great, Abir. The next question that comes up is similar to how you'd spoken about like multiple SKUs having different like contribution margins essentially. Mm-hmm. So Frederica asks, margin differs widely per product. how would you recommend looking at return on ad spend and that table if you are working with products with varying COGS and therefore varying margins? Would you do an average across all catalogs? Do you have a calculator for each? What does it look like?
That's an excellent question. So, yes, you could do an average across the catalog if you know what your average basket or overall product mix is when you're running ads. The second thing is you could do it on a per product basis. That's a little bit wonky. The real answer is that I would just develop a little bit more of a complex spreadsheet for that, but I keep it relatively simple because my whole intention with that is that I can just share with people and they can use it on their own. And these things can get a bit complicated naturally. So the truest answer is that you probably need to work with somebody who's a little accountant CFO like that can get a little bit more complex on that front. But yeah, using an average is a good place to start. The one thing to keep in mind is that, just for the sake of illustration, I'll keep it simple. If you're running no ads, you might have a certain blend of product mix. Like, for example, just simply, you have two products, you're selling $100 of this, $100 of that. This is an 80% margin, this is a 30% margin. Okay, that's your blend right now. When you start running ads, you might be pushing one product way more than the other one. So that average might change over time depending on your acquisition strategy. So I'm going to keep in mind, but the easiest way to start is, just use your average.
Cool. Now, I want to talk to people who are just getting started out, maybe not just getting started out, but like our smaller businesses that are in the house with us. So Megan asks, how would an early stage org be able to calculate contribution margin and optimize more in real time? What are the tools or resources you need to make this impactful?
Great question. So usually to be able to get a pretty decent, just like initial footing in the contribution margin calculation, you just need historical data. So as boring as it sounds, you just need to do your bookkeeping and get your records kind of in place to be able to see how much things are actually costing you historically, and then use that to inform your contribution margin calculations. If you're very, very early stage and you don't even really have that data and you're just planning it, do the best you can insofar as your estimates as to how each one of those things are going to work. So by talking to your suppliers, you should have an idea of COGS. By looking at shipping estimates, you should have an estimate over there. By looking at transaction fees, you should be able to get an estimate over there. So obviously you have to work with what you've got, but for most brands, even if they are early, they should have enough information in their bookkeeping work to be able to kind of suss that information out.
And does all of this, so Michelle has a question now relating to the B2B world. Does it differ from like D2C world to B2B side? So how can this be applied to a B2B and really long sales cycle, minimum 6 months to 6 years? Damn, that's a super long cycle.
That's long. That's commitment.
Yeah.
That's like dating someone. Shit, 6 years. So it's a good question. At the end of the day, the concept of contribution margin is not specific to DTC. It exists in all business. It's more of an accounting finance concept. So it does exist in the B2B world. It's just not going to manifest in quite the same way. And especially the calculator I built, it's specific for e-commerce companies. So we're not thinking about our ROAS and our ad spend when we're talking about B2B, but the concept does exist. So for example, I have one client that does a significant amount of DTC and a significant amount of B2B. So what we'll do in our reporting is that we'll break out each P&L a little bit differently. So you have your DTC performance, you have your B2B performance. And what that allows us to do is then look at, on a B2B basis, what's my contribution margin? So I take my revenue, subtract my cost of goods sold, and I subtract usually salespeople, commissions, broker costs, what's it called, trade spend, all that kind of stuff. You subtract that, and that still will give you a contribution margin because everything else is your fixed expenses. So conceptually, it does apply. It won't work in the calculator because that's for e-com, but yeah, the concept's there.
Amazing. Okay, we probably have time for 1 to 2 more questions, and Caitlin has a good one that I want to bring onto stage. So, how do you adjust your model for changes in time horizon? In other words, the model assumes that you achieve a return in the same month and that the same month that the spend occurs, but that isn't always the case. So, I think you alluded to it a little bit earlier on, but it's like, when do you want to be profitable, first order or not?
Yes, exactly. So for obviously depending on the type of business you have, and especially if you run a subscription type business, you can start taking that more CAC to LTV view of things and think, okay, fine, I acquired a customer, but over time I'm going to be able to recover the revenue or the profit or the margin on them so that it all kind of balances out. For the purpose of the template that I built out, it doesn't take that into consideration for 2 reasons. A, I'm trying to keep it simple so everybody can use it. And so I could probably someday build a much more complex version, which has your CAC to LTV levers in it as well. But the second thing, which is a bit more important, is that for most brands are not at the level of sophistication, scale, and risk tolerance, I believe, to be able to operate on a long-term horizon like that. I'm really generalizing here, but for most of them, it would be dangerous to do that because you're taking quite a bit of risk. If you're willing to go unprofitable now, lose out on cash flow, put yourself in the negative, hoping that you'll make that money later down the road. So it is a lot safer for brands to be able to focus on being profitable in the first order. Because if you can go all the way down to just being zero, let's say you just go break even on the first order because you want to be aggressive as hell. If you're confident that you're going to make that money later, great. All that's just gravy. And then if you know how much you're making, then you can get a little more aggressive and say, I'm willing to lose 10K on the first or on like per month on the first order, or 100K, whatever it is. To build out something like that, well, like I said, you just work with someone like me and we can help you with that. But for most brands, it's just a lot easier to focus on first order profitability or break even at the very least.
Love it. And now I'm stretching it. We're going to run out of time, but I found a question that I think is a really great one. I'm just curious to see how you tackle. So Carlos asks, best practices for spreading these financially driven creative strategy insights into culture, bottom up during onboarding or top down to media buyers and creative strategists. How do we create the culture of data driven and numbers driven creative strategy?
That's an excellent idea. There's obviously a lot of depth into how to disseminate conceptual things into culture, but I'll give you the shortest answer because we do have short time. I would say it all comes down to reporting. It's that classic thing of the incentives drive, or show me the measures and I'll give you give me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome, right? So it's all about focusing on what you measure and what you the drum that you bang. So if your reporting is always looking at contribution margin and you're compensating people based on contribution margin, you complain based on your contribution margin, still having that, not being so intellectually lazy that all you do is pay attention to profit and like not realize what people are actually doing, because not everybody can have that sort of an outsized impact on things, especially because plenty of things are out of our control. Like Facebook ads will just start sucking some days, not because we're not doing our job, it's because that's how the world works. But I think from a cultural perspective, it's that idea that if you have that in your reporting, so if a person, for example, they're reporting and their the number they have to answer for is ROAS, that's what they're going to focus on naturally. But if you have the things they can control, but then also always show contribution margin, like show that kind of North Star metric down the road as well, that is still something they should be thinking about, I think that's how you bring it something that is a little bit more at the forefront culturally. I hope that answers the question.
Oh, Abir, you came through and you mic dropped, man. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming through and giving everybody hopefully some really insightful things that they can walk away with. Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it. Take care, everybody.
Most definitely.